So Kai has navigated careers not just for his own self, but also executives across mostly the tech space, I'd say. Yeah. First at Russell Reynolds, and more recently now at Ferry. He's also a published author. Next up is Romina Saboa.
I go by Romy.
Romy. So Romy Saboa. But what really struck me is she's gone from working at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and sort of kicking off with the traditional start in some sense to her career, but then more recently navigating that into entrepreneurial, first as part of another venture, but then starting up her own venture, Pension B. She's now CEO of Pension B, and she's also got a 2-year-old?
16 months.
16-month-old child. So please welcome Romy. And our final panelist for the evening is John Yeomans. He's gone from doing traditional consulting and banking over a 30-plus year career to not only sort of working in startups, but advising startups and as a non-executive director and an angel investor. So we've got very different perspectives from these three panelists, and I am super excited to have everyone here to share their wisdom with us. Please welcome John as well. So I'll start with a question to Kai. So obviously you have the inside track on all of these placements that you've executed over the years. What is it that sort of, is there a common thread or set of characteristics that make successful candidates stand out, the ones that are targeting senior leadership roles?
It's quite interesting. Tomorrow there's going to be a column published in the Financial Times of Denmark about the same topic. And the short answer is, a career in top management doesn't necessarily lead to happiness. So you just have to be aware that, it's not always going that great. So before embarking on a top career, you need to think carefully about what's important for you. But typically, I've probably interviewed 200-300 CEOs and chairmen in my career. And the common theme is quite interesting. And that starts with the question, what ignited your ambition? And usually it's a moment or it's a situation where the person goes from being just talented like everyone to say, I want to make a difference. And the motivation for doing that can be, anything from having no money and growing up in a working class environment, having a mom they want to impress, that's by the way a theme for some, to, a lot of different things, but it's all usually starts with an experience, either anger or they moved mentally, moved to a different country, met someone who inspired them, etc. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is that the people who reach the top, they have something special. It's a bit like being an athlete. There's the 10,000 hour rule. If you spend 10,000 hours on something, you get good at it. And the reality is that these people work really, really hard. And they all train for that moment when, luck happens. And luck happens when coincidence meets good planning.
That's a great answer.
So I'll stop there. What's that?
No, that's great.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And to what extent do you think, having great brand names on your CV, great qualifications, how does that balance out to the actual sort of technical or core skills? How much of it is, one versus the other?
Okay. So the question was, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So the question was, what's the difference between having a brand name or something else on your CV? The reality is, and how many of you have an MBA from a very expensive, prestigious school? Excellent. Okay, that investment is about worth nothing after 5 years. And why is that? Because after that, it's really the results that counts. What, and how you made a difference, how you work with other people, how you achieve results through other people, etc. So yes, it's great, and what it gives you is the opportunity to get into the right circles where there's opportunity. What most other people struggle with is that they may be very talented and very ambitious and hardworking, but you can't get to that point where there's a coincidence between opportunity and and that is what a brand name gives you. After that, you're on your own.
Can I add something to that? I spent 5 years working against all the advice for little companies. They were great. No one knew who the hell they were. I then went and worked for 2 big companies doing jobs that were far less challenging, far less rewarding, but everybody knew who they were. Now, at the time, 5 years on, it all sort of melted out and it didn't matter. But at the time, the brand name mattered.
I was actually going to ask you that question. That's great. Okay. So I don't know if we want to get into detail here, but if we had a C-level search that's happening at your firm, for example, what's the typical process look like? I mean, what do you look for? How do you screen candidates? How does that typically work?
Okay, so it's all about finding the right person for the right opportunity. And it's quite simple. We get called by a chairman to find the CEO of a big company. We then sit down with the chairman and say, what are the strategic challenges this company will have for the next 5 years? Then we say, okay, what are the capabilities this individual needs to bring to execute that strategy? And that's usually a combination of experiences, some leadership competences, personality traits, and motivations. At Korn Ferry, we call them 4D. Korn Ferry's 4 dimension of leadership: experiences, competences, traits, and drivers. And we kind of, based on that, define a profile. And then we go looking for that individual. And then, as John and I discussed, what really always tilts this process is that then there's the chemistry and the cultural fit. And what you find is that, yes, this is the ideal candidate, but the one who usually gets the job, he or she, usually has a great fit with the company and the chairman from a cultural perspective and a personality perspective. And so all these elements play in, and our job is not to choose the right person, because ultimately that's the responsibility of the company, but to show them a selection of individuals who can do the job, but they'll do it differently. And then they have to say, we prefer this individual to actually lead this organization for the next 3 to 5 years.
Moving on slightly to a sort of related aspect, which is around career coaching. How many of you here have used a career coach or an executive coach over the course of your career? So just probably about maybe 10% of the group. I'd actually like to hear from each of the panelists about what you perceive career coaching's role to play, where and when is it most useful in your career, and where do you see that, Kai, perhaps from a candidate standpoint?
Maybe somebody else should.
Romy, would you like to go first?
I've never used one, so my perception is that it's very similar to a mentor role, but perhaps sort of very focused on you and your career. I think when you're the CEO of a company, you and your career are actually not as important anymore, because you're sort of responsible for everything and you have to make sure that everyone else's career is going really well. So I didn't really feel the need that I had to get one. I just felt I had to be responsible for everybody else's. But I think that it can be very beneficial, I think, especially if you are looking for that moment of inspiration, which is when I would imagine that, a career coach would really appeal to you, because being around different people, different groups of people can really spark something, like you said. And so having that outside independent perspective, especially when you've been out of business school for a while and you're not surrounded by a bunch of strangers who want to share their opinion, can I think it can be beneficial.
Yeah. John, what's your
Oh,
experience?
I personally tend to prefer mentors rather than career coaches. I had a wonderful experience which really was very important when I was about 25, when things were all going wrong. I saved a company and the senior guy became my mentor. By God, was he good. He could just sort of see through you. And I just an illuminating experience that someone that knew more about you than you. Now, why do I like mentorship as opposed to career counselling? I do a lot of mentoring because I like the freedom of being able to choose who I interact with either way. It's not just a sort of senior one saying, yes, I will agree to, it's the other way too. And I like the freedom of choice that goes with that. Of course, you can do that with career coaches as well. And now, being someone who really loves small companies, loves the freedom, loves the lack of rules, I think the diversity you get by doing it like that is a good thing. But maybe that's just back to the culture that you were talking about. You get the kind of person that fits with you.
Hi.
I think the the current fashion in business and individual career management is to get a coach, and it reminds me of
Woody Allen.
Woody Allen, exactly. Woody Allen, when he says that 1/3 of the population in New York, they have a psychiatrist, and so if we take a step back and say, what is it that people need? So we're individualists, okay? And we live in a time where I am very, very interesting. Okay, me. And I think that, the psychologist and the coach is kind of part of that. When we look at people who become successful and, throughout their career, there's one redeeming factor that often plays a really important role, which is what we call self-awareness. So self-awareness is the ability to look upon yourself from the outside and understand what impact you have on other people. Now, that's interesting because in a me time, that's not the normal perspective. But actually, the best leaders, and we've done a lot of research on this, the best CEOs, they have a quite high degree of emotional intelligence and self-awareness. Now, if you can use a coach or a mentor to improve your self-awareness, that is fantastic. But that should be the aim, in my view, of those type of sessions.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've seen it in two contexts. One in I work in Barclays, so senior execs get career coaching through 360 feedback. So feedback is solicited from all your peers, from your manager, from your direct reports, and then that sort of helps you identify some of the blind spots you may not be aware of. On the other side, Kellogg actually offers career coaching for alumni on an annual basis. So I've actually benefited from that when I was navigating bumps in the road, I should say. And it's really helpful because, as you said, the career coaches sometimes do feel like shrinks because you're sort of just using them as a sounding board. So I agree that mentorship is probably more sort of friendly, personal, and trust building as opposed to career coaching. But perhaps with the right career coach, with the right source of information, it does have a place in our career. So switching gears slightly then, John, perhaps you could talk a little bit about, obviously you are a mentor to people at startups. What have you sort of navigated this both sides, as in have you sought out mentors? Or how do people typically approach you? What is it that makes you want to take someone on as a mentee?
From the mentorship point of view as opposed to the career coach, for me, I love dealing with people that I really respect and I like. And I'm fortunate I've got a reasonable degree of freedom to do that. And dealing in small companies with entrepreneurs, you can sort of pick out people who you feel you can really help or whatever. And there's so much personal chemistry in there, as well as actually doing something, pushing something, giving a sort of semi-formal guidance on how to develop. So to me, it's very much to do with that. I like doing it that way as opposed to thinking of it in any professional way, because I just want the freedom to deal with people who I really relate to. That's where it comes from me. I'm currently mentoring about 15 people. Let's become, only one of the companies that I'm involved in is run by a female, but probably half the people I mentor are females. I find there's too much of the alpha male fighting each other, but there's a much greater ability to interact and listen both ways. It's quite a, can be a difficult relationship. With entrepreneurs, we want people who are really forceful, really driving, know exactly what they want to do, can walk through walls, and then we want them to listen to us. I mean, what a stupid idea.
It's true.
Yeah.
Want people with low self-awareness.
Yeah. The emotional intelligence is actually very important, and it can work, of course, with both sexes. But I find it's sort of easier to, these sort of entrepreneurs are going to punch their way through everything, and then say, well, look, actually, yes, they do need that sensitivity, and some don't have it.
We'll take a step back to ask a question that I think Gina and I have both been sort of, what sort of drove, you've obviously taken on different careers, as I mentioned in your intro, but what guided those decisions when you made career shifts all through your career? Was there a strand that tied it all together?
You, me?
To me?
To you,
No,
John,
you.
sorry.
It doesn't look at all obvious, but for the first 23 years, it was the telecoms industry, because the telecoms industry was part of the General Post Office, a nationalised monopoly that got privatised. It was very technically driven. It needed to learn about sales and marketing, because it became more important with competition. It needed to learn about business plans and joint ventures and strategic alliances. It then went into a dot-com boom frenzy of mergers and acquisitions, and I was privileged. I actually diverted my career to deal, I like small companies, to deal with the big deals internationally and run an international telecoms corporate finance team. So it looks 100% illogical to do tech, product management, marketing, sales, joint ventures, business planning, corporate finance. But actually, it was just the way the telecom industry unfolded. That's my excuse. Probably the truth is that I've got the attention span of a gnat.
Let me ask a question in sort of a couple of different ways. First with you, Kai. When you're looking at, filling a role, and you obviously look at the requirements, etc., and you've called out that the skill set and the cultural fit is absolutely key. But when you draw on your pool of candidates, typically you're placing at big firms. Is your pool of candidates restricted to people that come from other big firms, or is it a wider net than that?
I don't think it is. It depends on the role. It's an interesting question. I think the big companies tend to like people who have worked for other big companies. Why is that? Because big companies, you need to be good at working in a matrix. You have to follow processes. You can't be too entrepreneurial. You need to, lead through influence. And so a lot of the skills you need to be successful in the big company, you can only get in another big company. Now, with digital, that's a bit of a challenge. So actually, a colleague of mine, Fiona Vickers, which some of you may know her, she's head of our digital practice in Europe. We wrote a paper about 2 years ago where Ferry, I think we've tested 4 million people. So we looked at what are the personality traits of born digital versus innovative corporations. And there's some really interesting differences. So born digital people, for instance, they are not good at influencing. They're not good at working in a matrix. They're very results oriented. They're very open to new ideas. It's a bit like, Who cares whether the button is red or black as long as it generates more business? So they're much more, whereas people in big corporations, they tend to say, based on my experience, I believe this is the right, and I'll put my career at risk if I don't get my way. Digital people say, that's stupid. Why would you do that? You can just test it. Right? So the mindset is different with pluses and minuses, And so when big corporations try to execute a digital strategy, they got to figure out how do we take these people, and a former colleague of mine is the head of recruiting in Europe for Google, and she says that about 10% of their employee base is, to some degree autistic. Now that's not typical for big corporations, but these people are actually very, very good. So how do you accommodate? So the big challenge for big companies is that how do you take these people that actually are quite different, fit them in, but then also transfer their skills and knowledge to people who have a good cultural fit. And that's why most big corporations, they kind of fumble around at the moment and get beaten by small startups because they just can't move quickly enough. And then the people side is really tricky.
But is there a point of inflection where these digital enterprises become the big corporations?
Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, yeah, absolutely.
And how do you see that evolution of the mindset of that, from moving from digital to the big corp?
Well, the thing, it's a long answer, but I joined Apple in 1987, and was at the age of 27, I was the marketing director who launched Apple in Denmark, which was great fun, which proves the importance of mindset over experience. I had no relevant experience whatsoever, but it went well. And I think, Apple then was truly entrepreneurial. Apple today is not entrepreneurial. It's a big corporation. It's process-oriented.
Yeah.
Everything's dictated from, Silicon Valley, etc. So they believe they're kind of these nimble digital companies. They're not. They're just very, very powerful big corporations.
Can I turn it around with the large company question to you rather than the company? Because the large companies have got lots of resources, and when it goes well for you, there's lots of opportunity, although you might be a bit compartmentalized and constrained. But when it doesn't go well, I think that's when you can really come into your own. I think that's when you can actually say, what skills do I want to obtain? You take control. It's your career. It's not them guiding your career. It's when you actually say, I can get so much out of this organisation. I've been there and done this a number of times. In the very early days, economics someone talked about. I taught myself a fair bit of economics. But the actual whole business, I wanted to learn more about marketing. So I read the book, Kotler as it was in those days, and got on with getting myself into marketing roles because they were short of people in that. I wanted to get people management experience. That was difficult. So sales I wanted to get experience of because I'm a techie. And I thought, these are the gaps in my career that I want to fill in. How am I going to do this? The company had never had a direct sales force before. It failed to get a distribution contract. 2 months after that, it realised 12 million of sales depended on it. And then at long last, I got two things in one. I got the people management responsibility to set up a sales function. Now, my point is that these large corporations can offer you a lot. I mean, even if it's none of those, and it's the opportunity to do charitable work or something, take control, decide what skills you want, and go for them. I mean, the final one for me was corporate finance. I was in KPMG. I was a consultant. In those days, they had a rule. I could work on corporate finance projects, as I was talking with someone about transaction services, but I couldn't go into corporate finance because I wasn't an accountant. They changed that. Well, that's the best thing they ever did to me, because when I realised I couldn't go into it, I got a real proper job and ended up running a team. Now, your choice. Use large companies, you can get a lot out of them.
And actually, piggybacking on that sort of comment, over the course of your career, can you sort of call out what you liked and didn't like with big corporates versus the smaller ones? Was the office politics different, dynamic different? How did you rise above it? How did you use it to sort of make yourself more effective?
I think, of course, I changed over time. You know, I was a complete rebel at the age of 22, and I tried to retain some element of rebellion at my current age of 60. The things I didn't like, I mean, the things I liked and didn't like were actually all cultural. I'm not a natural big company person. I'm somewhat individualistic. I didn't know it, but among the big six as they were then, KPMG was the most individualistic in its culture. It let partners do things their own way rather than spraying everybody the same. So I chose the one that I could find my way through. HSBC, in some ways, very funny culture, in some ways brilliant, in that small, local, the same individualism, and I didn't know I was doing it, let's be quite honest, but the natural affinity was to go into organisations like that. The other side of it was, in some ways, some elements of it centrally controlled. Back as recently as 1997, every single loan of $1 million or more around the world was being signed off individually by the chairman, and I watched him do it. It was an amazing process. In other words, some elements of real central control, but you see why, because they don't want bad loans. So I learned to respect elements of the culture and play into some elements of the culture. The bit I really dislike is the constraining, mind-numbing inability to act. No one knows who's responsible for a decision. No one really cares. If there's a decision, work out who's responsible. Whatever it is, if you're pushing for something, work out who's responsible. And if you can't, go and ask your boss. And if they can't, leave.
Is there a follow-up question to that from the audience? Okay. I'll turn back to the panelists. And I'd like to hear from each of you about from each of your perspectives, whether it's you seeking out investors for Pension B, or John with you mentioned advising women, and obviously you've placed women in senior exec roles. How have you seen gender disparity being addressed in the workplace over the course of your careers? And can you give us some examples of continuing challenges that you still see? I'll start with you, Romy.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I never used to believe that there was like a gender gap, because I grew up in a family where my mom was kind of the boss. So I never really, I was not aware of this at university. And the first time that I thought that gender was a thing was when I got to Goldman and people kept saying that I was female, and like suggesting that I have a female mentor. Right. And so I think that is actually a thing that happens a lot at big companies. You come in as a female and they're like, oh my God, you're a woman. We know another woman. And we should put you together because you can really learn from each other. So that was the first time I actually became aware of it. And I thought, I'm not going to, bother with this stuff. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And then as I got older, I started realizing that there weren't that many women around me anymore. And in my analyst class, there were actually quite a lot of women. By the time I got to associate level, there were fewer women. And by the time I was in the financial institutions group, I was the only female at my level. So, which is kind of shocking because I wasn't that senior. So imagine what it looks like further above, like just no one there. And so when I left Morgan Stanley, the feedback I gave was, you need more women. And the guy said, well, you're not helping very much, are you? But, by that time, I'd become really attuned, to being a woman. And that, sometimes I would be invited to do things because I was female. And I started wondering, why is this happening? But it wasn't really until I had my child that I actually realized what happens, because that's when the difference comes in. Yeah. Once you have your child, everything sort of changes, because you have to still give 100% to your career, but you have to form another 100% to give to your child. And at that point, you really have to start making trade-offs, like who's going to pick up my kid after school? And for most women, they are the natural choice to go and leave work early. And by early, I mean like 5:50. So they can be there at 6 when the daycare closes. Because not everyone can afford to have a nanny, and like you do have to use daycare. And so, once you have to start making those decisions, it becomes very clear that women sort of feel this is my responsibility and I need to do this. And, I don't think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that men have that same overwhelming sense of I need to be there at 6 p.m., which is why you see women heading out at 5:50 and men staying until 8. And then that creates a perception of, okay, this guy's more motivated. Even though the woman may be logging in later and doing the same amount of work. Yeah. So it was only really when I had my kid that I realized that, these are real trade-offs like that people need to make, because you just can't leave your child in daycare after 6. It's just not possible. So I think what that comes down to is actually a really practical solution of what can be done differently. Which for me comes down to childcare, right? And we always used to, at Goldman in particular, we were always amazed that there was, childcare in the building, but you were only allowed to use it 20 days a year. Now, imagine how amazing it would be if you could actually take your child to work and drop them off there, and when you're finished, like, you can go and pick them up. And, as a woman, you can stay as late as you like, and your child is going to get fed. You know that no one is going to leave them on the street at 6 p.m. And just having some of that sorted would make an enormous difference. But the current situation in this country does not support that. And it does not support women taking breaks either to look after their children, because whenever I've seen anyone try to come back, their motivations are questioned. Yeah. But none of the men that are questioning the motivation ever had to make that choice. So the current situation just doesn't work. But I think that there is an onus, and I think the onus is on industry actually to solve it, because we can't wait for government to do everything. And I think that employers need to actually make the change that they need to make, whether it comes to that or to hiring more women, which I'll stop now because, I could talk about that separately.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. So just, I come from Denmark. So would you expect that in Denmark there's a high participation of women in leadership roles, or a low participation?
Higher than here.
Higher than here. Okay, it's the lowest in Europe, just above Albania.
Wow.
No. And why is that? So, and this is, in my view, the real dilemma is that it's culturally based, a lot of this. It's about the role of men, and it's about the role of women. It's about the perception of what is a good mother. So my wife, to be a good mother in Denmark, you kind of work part-time, pick up your kid in the morning, or drop them off in the morning, pick them up in the afternoon. And I had her meet a couple of my partners from Russell Reynolds, very successful female headhunters. And we had dinner, and we talked about what is the definition of a good mother in the UK. And the definition they had was very different. It was like, okay, if we're with the child 3 or 4 times a week, either in the morning and the evening, that's a good week. And so I think there's a lot of culture in this. One, there's John and I, we're from a generation where, men and women were equal, and therefore they were the same. I think we're getting to a point where we need to recognize that we are different, we have different needs, and I completely agree that the onus is on industry. So I had another column last week commenting on this, where I said to the Danish business leaders that you don't solve your collective problem by asking headhunters to steal women from each other. You have to solve your own problem. You have to figure out within your industry, and every industry is different, by the way, how do we actually promote, what do we need to do to help women balance work and life? Because otherwise the 10,000 rule will kick in, which is if you run a marathon and you take, half an hour out in the middle, you're behind.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this is really complex, but it's up to the companies to sort it out.
I see a lot of companies promoting sort of, oh, in order to have more, women in senior positions, you should promote more part-time work. Like, I personally don't agree with that. I think that in order to have more women in senior positions, you need to help women to
Leadership.
compete more
Yeah.
effectively. It's not about like making everybody work part-time. I think it's about solving the actual problems that are causing women to drop out. And the single biggest problem is your child.
I largely agree with Romy. It's changing very slowly over a long time. I'm in a difficult field, which is science and technology. Do remember that in that field at least, so much comes from the education system. I was in a course of 99 people with one woman. Now, if you then allow for the 30s career break child and wonder where they are now in senior management, it's tough. I think this 30s thing can be, I can't change the education system, but it is gradually shifting that proportion. I think the 30s thing is very interesting. When I walk to the station, I walk past a school. I would virtually never have seen a man dropping off the children in the 1990s when I started doing it. Okay, it's not many now, but it's about 3 or 4. There's a couple I really respect. I think, first of all, one has to accept that there's a compromise in this. And we all learn the compromises. We treat them different ways. There's a couple I really respect where the bloke has taken it really on. He's just as much a career guy as she is, but it's a very happy combination. Now, it can't always work like that, but what I'm saying is there is a compromise and there are ways to manage it. The bit I find difficult is actually for the child being in really long time, 12-hour working, and that's the bit I disagree with you on. I think having children in care to 8 o'clock at night and I used to work till 2 in the morning, is not an easy thing to do. I think there's a compromise in there.
It does sound like we shouldn't underestimate the impact of culture and the perception of women and their own evaluation of their worthiness as a mom. And then to your point about the current infrastructure and how corporates are set up and what their expectations are, and recognizing that there is an additional requirement to support women in their ambition to be a good caregiver and parent. And also, I think you're right, the education system, particularly in fields like science and technology, has sort of skewed the mix of people coming out. For me though, this one point I want to make is, do you also think there's something to be said about women not expecting enough from their partner or from and maybe it's conditioning? It's a combination of these three things. So maybe I'd like to hear your views on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because we actually just had to put my son in daycare because up until now, my mother-in-law had actually been looking after him in an incredibly full-time way where I could, finish when I need to finish and my husband could finish when he needs to finish. And now someone needs to take him at 8 and pick him up at 6. And when we went to look at the daycare, we're like, who's going to pick him up at 6? And I said, I'll do it, just out of, habit. I said, I'll do it. It felt like the right thing to say. And then, of course, yesterday rolled around and I said, I can't be there at 6 because I'm going to be on a panel.
It's the backup options always.
And my husband looked at me, what do you mean you can't do it?
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'm on a panel, so I can't be at the daycare. And so he had to leave early to pick up my kid. But I can totally see how a man will say, I can't be there, because I'm at work.
Yeah.
And it's just a much more natural thing for a man to say than a woman to say, I think,
You're
just
right.
from my own experience, and every woman is different, every man is different and whatnot. And some men become, stay-at-home dads, of course, but it's not the norm.
It's
the
not.
norm.
It's changing for the better.
Yeah.
So paternity leave 1 year is
It's
mandatory.
mandatory.
But I think there are a couple of trends working against each other here. One is that I genuinely believe that there's a big acceptance in society that it's a shared responsibility, which is good. But globalization is working against it. So what's happening in Denmark is that, most companies have to be global today, which means that you have a leadership position, you have a global job. What do? You have to travel. Oops. You're away from your family, you're the kids for a longer period of time. So at the same time, educationally, there are now more female graduates from universities than men, and they get higher grades. Women are smarter, we know that, and they work harder. So what's happening is that most of these women, they choose to work in the public sector. Why is that? Because you don't need to travel. Denmark is a small country, and you can drop off the kids and pick them up, and that the whole system is kind of tuned to that. So Denmark now has the most talented public sector, but in Western Europe, but it doesn't necessarily help the overall competitiveness. So there's some real paradoxes that are tricky to solve.
Actually, I've increasingly seen people saying, I want a mentor, and going and saying, well, actually, I quite like that person over there. Let's ask them. And honestly, it is a privilege to be asked, almost always. I do actually think that is something that could be done a lot more. Yeah. People respect it, love it. For them, it is a credibility to be chosen by someone to be asked to help.
Romy, did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a pretty natural mentoring relationship with the chairman of my company. But for me to be some sort of mentoring relationship, we have to have, business goals in common is the feeling that I get, because, we need to be invested in the same things. But then it's more about, I trust this person's experience because I may not have had like a 40-year experience, and I can learn a lot from it. And, so it's about recognizing that person has something that you don't have, but you have a shared goal, and therefore bringing the two things together works well for me.
Okay.
And, this sounds quirky, but my best mentor is actually my wife, because I'm a quite rational individual, and she has enormous capacity of emotional intelligence and how to build relationships, and all the issues I have in the workplace is actually around that, and it's just fabulous to have someone that is on your side, and most of the time that can help you.
They say the most important decision you make in business is who you marry, actually.
It's true.
And I think, I would probably agree with that.
Yeah. On that note, apart from career building, relationship building is also key.